is Adam historical? How do we think about science and theology intersecting on this hugely popular and much debated topic today? Well, my guest today is Dr. William Lane Craig, one of the leading Christian philosophers and apologists in the world. And he has a book coming out at the time of this recording next week on the quest for the historical Adam. He has spent a lot of time thinking, researching this, and is putting forward a plausible model of how he believes we can make sense of it. This is such a hot, divided topic. Our goal today is to get clarity of where you're coming from, Dr. Craig, why you conclude that. And then I know you would invite criticism and feedback once people understand where you're coming from. So
Absolutely.
First off, thanks for taking the time to come on. Let me just ask you, you've been producing a ton of material from the Atonement, other works recently. Why did you choose to focus on the historical Adam?
Well, I have in mind a long-range project of writing a systematic philosophical theology. And I realized that if I were to do such a thing, I would need to bone up on certain areas of systematic theology where I felt weak. One such area was the Atonement. Another such area is theological anthropology. And so the last 4 years, I've spent addressing those two subjects full time. And the book, In Quest of the Historical Adam, is the fruit of my work on the person of Adam and Eve and the subject of human origins.
Bill, our mutual friend Josh Swamidas, has written a book recently on the genealogical Adam and Eve. We have other books that are coming out and other friends. There's a ton of people talking about this. How would you say, what sets your quest or your approach maybe apart from the way others have looked at the historical Adam?
My approach differs from Josh's in that in order to have Adam and Eve be the truly universal progenitors of every human being that has ever lived on the face of this planet, I push them deeply into the remote past, somewhere prior to 750,000 years ago. And by putting them so far in prehistory, it enables one to affirm that every person who has ever lived on this planet is a descendant of this primordial, original human couple, which I take to be an essential teaching of Genesis 2, as well as of the statements about Adam in the New Testament.
I think your approach to Genesis and the way you think about the intersection of science and faith is also unique, but we're going to get into that. There's a line, I think it's literally the third line in your book. And you write this, you said, people on both the left and the right can be expected to be upset with this book and unfortunately its author. Tell me why that might be the case.
Well, young Earth creationists who believe that the world was created around 6,000 years ago in 6 literal 24-hour days, who believe that a few thousand years ago there was a worldwide flood that exterminated all terrestrial life on Earth, who believe that all of the world's languages stem from confusion at a Babylonian ziggurat called the Tower of Babel, are going to think that I'm compromising on these biblical truths. On the other hand, there are a great many people who think it's absurd that there could be an original human pair from whom all humanity is descended. They would say, at best, they were just two people in a wider population of thousands of people at that time whom God had selected. And then the people existing today are all descended from that pair. And they would say it is literally scientifically impossible. Dennis Venema, a biologist who wrote an influential book on this subject, said we can know with heliocentric certainty, that is to say, as certain as that the sun is at the center of the solar system, that the human race is not descended from an original human pair. And so from the left and the right, I anticipate great pushback.
I appreciate that the next line in the book you said, look, whether you agree with me or not, this is the result of a lot of thought and reflection. And I just plead for a sober assessment of the views. And I think that's fair. And I hope people on the left and the right and everywhere else will approach it that way. Now, there's a ton of debate about the historical Adam. It's one of the hottest questions in the intersection of science and faith. But one question is, why does the historical Adam matter so much? Because it wasn't addressed, as far as I'm aware, in any ecumenical council, such as the Nicene Creed.
Right. For those who hold to the doctrine of original sin, that is to say that we are culpable for Adam's sin, or that Adam's sin corrupted human nature and we all bear that disease, the historical Adam is absolutely crucial. Because if he is merely a fictional character that never existed, obviously we cannot be culpable for the wrongdoing of a fictional person or be corrupted by his fall. Now, I myself don't hold to that classical doctrine of original sin. I think that that is neither taught in Genesis 3 nor in Romans 5. I think what Paul teaches is that Adam was the floodgate through which sin entered into the human race, and then sin spread to all men because, as Paul says, all men sin. Now, if that's right, it means Adam has to be a historical person, because again, if he were purely fictional, then sin could not have entered the human race through this individual. So I think that that requires a historical Adam. And I also think that the consequences of denying the historical Adam are very serious. They send reverberations through your theology that will affect, first of all, your doctrine of inspiration and then your doctrine of Christ. If it's true that Paul, for example, teaches that there was a historical Adam through whom sin came into the world, and yet that is false, then you have to say that the Bible teaches falsehoods. And that is going to require you to revise your doctrine of inspiration in such a way that inspiration is consistent with the teaching of error. Moreover, since Jesus plausibly believed that Adam was a historical person, you're going to have to explain how Jesus can be divine and yet hold false beliefs. One of the essential properties of divinity is omniscience, and an omniscient person cannot hold false beliefs. He only believes truths. So if Jesus believed falsehoods, then how can he be omniscient? How can he be divine? You're going to have to revise your Christology in such a way that Jesus could hold or seemingly hold false beliefs and yet be divine. And so I do think that there are very, very serious reverberations that will result from the denial of the historical Adam.
Would you put the historical Adam then in the same category as the resurrection? Both you and I have written books and defended it. 1 Corinthians 15 is clear. If Paul is not risen, our faith is in vain. Would you say similarly, if Adam is not historical, our faith is in vain, or would you qualify it differently?
No, I think that would be really misplaced theological priority, Sean. I would say that it would require you to revise your doctrine of inspiration and your Christology, but by no means would the denial of the historical Adam make you a heretic or separate you from salvation. In fact, in the opening chapter of the book, I explore a few of these worst case scenarios, as I call them. I say, suppose my proposal doesn't work. Suppose we're stuck with one of these worst case scenarios where the Bible teaches that there was a historical Adam, and yet there wasn't one. And I try to show that even given that worst case scenario, there are moves that we can make to preserve Orthodox Christian belief, even given those reverberations.
So in this book, you're really trying to get to kind of a mere Christianity, minimal doctrine of what the historical Adam is, can it be defended plausibly? And so that's why
Yes.
at the beginning, you're saying even if there's not a historical Adam, which you don't embrace, it's not necessarily fatal to Christianity,
Right.
although it would take serious revisioning compared to finding the body of Jesus. So important,
Exactly.
but not essential. Okay.
Exactly. If the resurrection is false, Christianity is doomed. That is fatal blow. But if Adam never existed, that's not, I think, a fatal blow to Christianity.
Okay, got it. I have clarity on where you stand. That's very helpful, I think, for people walking and reading along. That's great. Now, tell us how you started your quest. And I love that you call the book In Quest of the Historical Adam, because this feels like a very personal journey for you that involves some challenges and maybe some just fears at times and wrestling with the evidence. You've even been public on some of you. So it really made this journey interesting to watch you process this. But tell us how you start your quest logically.
It really has been a struggle for me personally as I've wrestled deeply and honestly with this question. And I begin my quest of the historical Adam with an analysis of what our biblical commitments are as Bible-believing Christians. What does the Bible commit us to about the historical Adam? And I think this is very important, Sean, because it avoids the error of concordism. Concordism is trying to read modern science into the Bible, trying to read it in between the lines. And that distorts the teaching of the Bible. It makes every generation able to read their contemporary science back into these narratives. And so I begin by just bracketing science altogether, just laying it aside and saying, let's look at these narratives and ask ourselves, how would they have been understood by the author and audience at the time that they were written? And it's only after trying to determine what our biblical commitments are that I then turn to the question, all right, are those biblical commitments compatible with the deliverances of modern science, history, and linguistics?
Okay, so let me just play the skeptic for the sake of fun here. Somebody might say, okay, Bill, I've heard you speak, I've heard you teach, you believe in an old earth. You said in principle you don't have problem with a kind of common descent as long as God is designing the process. So you go to the text and find a theological system that is consistent with where you started. Push back on that and tell me why that might not be telling the whole story.
Obviously, all of us have a viewpoint from which we begin. But that doesn't mean that we cannot try to be objective in how we weigh the evidence and arguments. And I have struggled as best I can to weigh the evidence objectively to determine our biblical commitments. Now, I would be disingenuous, Sean, if I were to say, I don't want the young earth creationist interpretation to come out true. To me, that is a nightmare. My greatest fear is that the young earth creationist might be right in his hermeneutical claim that Genesis does teach those things that I described earlier. And I say that would be a nightmare because if that's what the Bible teaches, it puts the Bible into massive, I think, irredeemable conflict with modern science, history, and linguistics. And I don't want that to happen. So, yes, it's true. I don't want young earth creationist interpretation to be right. But nevertheless, I really do in the book struggle to be as objective as I can in saying, what did these narratives mean to their original audience when they were written and read?
Fair enough. Let's jump into how you approach the biblical passages in Genesis 1 through 11. And you use a term that definitely is going to require some explanation. The moment I say it, if people are not aware, they maybe tune out. So at least stay in and let him explain his view if you're tracking along. you refer to Genesis as mytho-history.
Genesis 1 to 11.
1 through 11.
Sean,
Good.
the primeval history. From the call of Abraham in chapter 12 on, you have straightforward historical narrative. But Genesis 1 to 11 is acknowledged by every New Testament commentator to be apart from the rest of Genesis, to be a special sort of narrative and a peculiar genre of literature. And the classification of this genre as mytho-history was suggested to me by the Old Testament scholar Bill Arnold, who teaches at Asbury Seminary. And as Arnold described this category, this genre of literature, the light just came on for me because it seemed to me that this was a very, very plausible genre classification of Genesis 1 to 11. Now, what do we mean by mytho-history? We're not talking about myth in the popular sense of the word, like the myth of the self-made man or the myth of the low-calorie diet. Rather, we're talking about myth in the way that folklorists and classicists use that term to differentiate it from things like folk tales and legends. A myth, in this sense, is a traditional, sacred narrative that attempts to ground realities contemporaneous with the author, including in a society's institutions and values and natural phenomena, in events of the deep primordial past. And I think you would agree that that description fits Genesis 1 to 11 to a T. And one of the things that I do in the book is go through these narratives in detail, just showing how again and again and again the family resemblances of myths describe Genesis 1 to 11. However, they're not pure myth. They also have a historical interest, as is evident by these narratives being ordered by genealogies. Genealogies that terminate in people who are indisputably intended to be historical, like Abraham and his children. And these genealogies are like the backbone of these primordial narratives. They turn these prehistoric narratives into a prehistoric chronology or a primeval history. And so that's why the great Assyriologist Thorkild Jakobsen characterized this as a unique genre of literature that he dubbed mytho-history. And Bill Arnold, whom I heard, was simply following Thorkild Jakobsen in this analysis. And I think that it is an extremely plausible analysis of the genre of Genesis 1 to 11. And what I noticed, Sean, in reading various Old Testament commentators like Gordon Wenham or John Collins or John Walton and others, is that this is really the view that they hold to, but they don't dare use the terminology of myth because it's so apt to be misunderstood. So they find euphemisms to substitute. Wenham likes to talk about proto-history. Walton talks about imagistic history. I think Collins talks about worldview history. All of this is exactly what Jakobsen meant by mytho-history, but they try to conceal the real nature of this by these euphemisms. And I'm persuaded that we owe it to our Christian laity and congregations to be straight up with them and to define our terms carefully and accurately, and then make straightforward assertions about what we're saying rather than try to mask it beneath acceptable euphemisms.
A few minutes ago, you said all New Testament scholars agree that history starts at Genesis 12 moving
Did I
forward.
say
Did you
New
mean,
Testament or Old Testament?
you said new, but I assume you meant old, just for clarification.
Yeah, I didn't mean new.
Okay, got it. Just want to make
Yeah,
sure for listeners. Okay, so what you're
sorry.
saying is history as we look at it normally, for lack of a better term, Genesis 12 clearly has that form of history. There's a shift
Yes.
in the narrative after 11. So 1
Oh,
through
yeah.
11 is proto history, mytho history that contains some history, but
Yes.
also some other stories that weren't meant to be taken historical. Is that fair as far
Yes.
as it goes?
Yeah, weren't meant to be taken literalistically. When you
Literalistically.
look at myth, what you discover is that myth is often written in figurative language, often fantastic language, and therefore wasn't taken literalistically, even by those who accepted the myth as authoritative for their culture.
Okay, so if this approach is correct, how should this shape the way, in your view, we read Genesis 1 through 11 then, and the story of Adam and Eve?
I think it should prompt us not to be over literalistic in the way we read these narratives. And once you begin to look at them in terms of mythohistory, it's difficult to look at them in any other way.
Hmm.
I mean, when you read a story about two people in an arboretum with these magical trees whose fruit, if you eat it, will grant you immortality or knowledge of good and evil. And then there's this talking snake who comes along and tempts them into sin. And then you have this anthropomorphic God walking in the cool of the garden, calling out audibly to Adam in his hideout. You think, well, of course, this is figurative and metaphorical language. This isn't meant to be read in this sort of literalistic fashion. And so once you begin to see these narratives this way, I think you begin to ask yourself, how could I have read them any other way? It would be like reading Aesop's fables literalistically,
Hmm.
as really about talking animals, for example, rather than as figurative or metaphorical in order to teach some moral lesson.
Okay, so apart from the New Testament, which we're going to go to in a minute, in which you argue 1 Corinthians 15 and Romans 5 make it clear that biblically there must be a historical Adam, Genesis
Yes.
1 through 11, taken on its own merit, you've given examples of why you think there's clearly these fantastic mythical elements involved in it. Is it the genealogies and the connection where it stops in Romans 12 that convinces you there's a historical component behind this?
In Genesis 12, now I caught you giving the
Oh,
wrong reference. You said Romans 12.
oh,
um,
good call.
yes, that is exactly right.
Okay, fair enough. So last question. Would you say, when you mention Aesop's fable, I can imagine people saying, wait a minute, this is totally made up, not historical at all, as far as I know. Maybe I'm getting that
Right.
wrong. But would the ancients have read Genesis in this fashion, or do you think they took it more literalistic?
You know, I don't know, Sean,
Hmm.
if there was a kind of universal way of interpreting these passages. One of the things that I rebuke Old Testament scholars for in the book is the presumption of saying things like ancient Egyptians believed that, or ancient Mesopotamians believed that. I don't
Okay.
think we know what most Egyptians or Mesopotamians or ancient Israelis uh, believed. But I think we can say that there are elements in these stories that exhibit this sort of mythological literary genre, which the author and his audience would have recognized to be fantastic if they were taken literally. And that therefore that gives good reason to think that they were not always taken in a literal way.
Okay, let's shift to the New Testament. and talk about what this contributes to the historical Adam. And there's a lot of passages, whether it's in Matthew 19, Jesus, whether it's Acts chapter 17. We won't have time to go into all of those, which you do in your book, but make a distinction for us between what you call the literary and the historical Adam.
This is a distinction which is widely made among New Testament scholars when it comes to dealing with how the New Testament treats figures in literature that the New Testament authors cite. So, for example, when they talk about Moses, is this the Moses that actually lived, or is it the Moses as described in the Pentateuch? When they talk about Adam, is this the actual historical Adam, or is this just the Adam of the story? And you cannot assume too quickly that the literary figure is the same as the historical figure. We all know examples in our own day where we will say things like, just as Robinson Crusoe had his man Friday to help him, so I have an assistant who helps me in my research. And that doesn't commit me to the historicity of Robinson Crusoe. It's just a reference to this literary figure. And one of the contributions, Sean, that my book makes that I'll be very, very interested to see how people react to is I show that the New Testament authors cite mythological and fabulous figures from Jewish folklore and Greek mythology that I think none of us want to be committed to historically. And so these would be prime examples of where the New Testament authors are using these literary figures to illustrate Christian doctrines and truths, but they don't require us to believe in the historicity of those figures any more than my reference to Robinson Crusoe requires us to believe in the historicity of that man.
So is it fair to say the reference, if they reference non-biblical literature, it doesn't mean it's not historical, but we can't assume that it is?
Yes, that is correct. Okay. That is correct. Though, in some of these cases, we have really good grounds for thinking it's not historical. For example, the figures of Jannes and Jambres that are referred to in 1 Timothy, you can show the history of this pair in Jewish folklore, how it evolved, and the wild legends about Jannes and Jambres and the magicians' contests they had with Moses and all the rest. To think that this is really historical would be a wild stretch of the imagination. Or the example in 1 Corinthians where Paul talks about this well that traveled along with the Israelites through the desert during their wilderness wanderings. In Jewish folklore, there was this well about the size of a beehive that kind of rolled along on the ground, and then every night it would stop and it would yield water for the Israelites to drink out of. And Paul refers to this legend and says, and that well was Christ. Now, are you going to say that that identification requires you to believe that this story about this traveling well is true? I don't know anybody who thinks that's true. So in some cases, it's not simply that we can't assume that it's historical because it's cited by a New Testament author. But in some cases, the stories, again, are so fantastic that I think we can say, no, this is plausibly not historical.
So we can say it's not historical, but in 1 Corinthians 15 and Romans 5, you say it's also not just literary, and we have reason to believe it is historical. Now, we could parse these passages in great depth, but just tell us kind of as simply as possible why you think those passages are best interpreted as requiring a historical Adam.
Very simply, because a literary figure cannot have effects outside of the literature in which that figure appears. The person Hamlet in the play by Shakespeare was supposed to be a Danish prince who actually lived, but there was no such person as Hamlet. So Hamlet can't have any sort of effects outside the play. But what Paul asserts about Adam is that through Adam, sin came into the world, and because of Adam's sin, all men died, and sin reigned from Adam to Moses, a historical period of time. And we're still dealing with it today, says Paul. And so it seems to me that because of the extra literary effects of this figure cannot be purely literary, but must be historical.
So you don't go into how that sin is passed and whether it's imputed or whether it's our nature is corrupted or it's guilt. But your point being, whatever model it is, the Bible teaches that something objectively is passed on, which takes us out of literature into the real historical world.
I do, in fact, give a discussion of these different ways in which Adam's sin might have affected us and express my skepticism concerning the original culpability view or the corrupted nature view. And I offer a version in terms of sin's effect upon society, and it's permeating all of our cultural institutions and environment in which a child is raised. But then at the end, I make the point that you just made, that whatever view of the effects of Adam's sin you adopt, whatever view you take, it's going to require a real historical person and not just a literary figure.
Okay, good. Let's shift to, you started with science and you started with scripture to do your best to understand it on its own merits. And then you shift to the scientific question. So just tell us kind of broadly, how do you approach science? What's kind of your philosophy of science that would shape how you think about it and maybe its integration with theology?
Well, since my question is, am I as a Christian in conflict with contemporary science as a result of my biblical commitments, I simply accept what the deliverances of contemporary science are. Now, that doesn't mean that I believe in them or defend them. I simply assume them. I say, given that there was a historical Adam, or that the Bible commits me to a historical Adam, then assuming what modern science has to say about human origins, is there some conflict between my biblical commitments and the deliverances of contemporary science?
Okay, that's really helpful, because in the book itself, there's certain ideas of common descent and certain ideas of dating that could be consistent with an evolutionary model. Your point is, regardless of whether you personally embrace that or not, you're simply saying, given your biblical commitments, let's assume the deliverances of modern science and see if they can be wed together in a plausible fashion. Is that fair?
That's exactly correct. And my contention is that even given the full-blown theory of evolution of the human species, there's no incompatibility with my biblical commitment to universal human pair or progenitors.
All right, so let's unpack your approach a little bit in light of modern science. And obviously the question you're asking is, when did humans begin? And then let's see if that's consistent with a biblical model as you understand it. That raises the question, what does it even mean to be human? So what's your understanding of what a human being is?
Well, paradigmatically, we understand what it is to be human by ourselves. We look at ourselves, we know that we are human, and so we know what a paradigm of humanity looks like, somebody like ourselves. So there needs to be a certain anatomical similarity to us. That would mean that hominids in the past that didn't have adequate brain size, for example, would not be human. But mere anatomical similarity is not enough. what you want to look for would be those cognitive capacities that would be indicative of full human behavior.
Okay.
And here there is quite a consensus among scientists as to what kind of behaviors those would be. I cite a pair of anthropologists, Alison Brooks and Sally McBrady, who explained that the indicators of modern cognitive human behavior would be things like planning for the future, symbolic use of materials to represent non-physical realities, advances in technology and inventiveness and so forth. And what McBrady and Brooks then do is look for what they call certain archaeological signatures that are indicative of these modern cognitive behaviors. And they list around 20 to 25 of these archaeological signatures. Well, in the book, I have only time to discuss some of the most striking, but they are unbelievably striking, Sean. And I think what you can show is that these archaeological signatures of modern human behavior go back hundreds of thousands of years in Africa and Europe and the Middle East, indicating that human beings originated on this planet sometime before the divergence of the human race into different species like Neanderthals and Homo sapiens and Denisovans.
This part of your book to me was one of the most interesting when you walk through the emergence of art, the emergence of tools, these very complex building structures that were made.
Unbelievable.
Language development. I mean, clear, like burying the dead. There's clear signs that these are people, human beings, whatever their size and body structure, that are sufficiently similar to us and would categorize as being human. Now,
I think that's right. And I am not willing, Sean, to write Neanderthals out of the human race. I think that kind of dehumanizing attitude is, frankly, morally unconscionable. It's a kind of racism in a way. These were people just as much as ancient Homo sapiens were, just as much as we are. And we should not dehumanize them in that way.
Okay. So then tell me, you said hundreds of thousands of years. When do you think when would you scientifically place the first human being sufficiently like us, which would help us know on your model where to place Adam and Eve, roughly?
It would be somewhere between 1 million and 750,000 years ago. Now, that's a broad range, but it does narrow down very considerably the candidates for who Adam and Eve might have been. I think the best candidate is Homo heidelbergensis, or Heidelberg man, who is the most recent ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. Now, and so probably the most novel thing in the book is my proposal to identify Adam and Eve as Heidelberg man.
Let me come back to that in a minute. But one of the big challenges that I've heard consistently against a historical pair is that the scientific evidence shows that human beings could not have gone back to less than, typically it's stated, a group of 10,000 individuals. Why do you disagree with that?
That calculation made by Dennis Venema and others was based upon interpreting human beings to be restricted to Homo sapiens. And you could not get an original pair of Homo sapiens in the recent enough past to be able to explain the genetic diversification of our contemporary population. But you see, I think, as I said, that's a prejudicial identification. Neanderthals were just as human as Homo sapiens. And so we need to push that original human pair back further in time to the most recent common ancestor of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And when you do that, even Venema now agrees
Hmm.
that anytime earlier than 500,000 years ago, population genetics cannot rule out the
Hmm.
existence of an original human pair who are the universal progenitors of mankind.
I see some great questions coming up in here, and we are going to come to them. Be patient. I've got three more for you. Maybe paint for us. You have this in the very last page of your book, kind of in it's like an epilogue or putting it all together, where you say, here's what my model would look like if it were true. And again, I want to emphasize, you're not saying this is necessarily true. You're saying this is
Right.
one way you think
Yeah.
logically modern science doesn't contradict the way you've explained Genesis. So for
Yeah.
people trying to put this together, what would it look like practically? Like if you were explaining this to a kid about Adam and Eve, what might it look like? And you've written some kid
Yeah.
books, so I can't let you off the hook for this one.
Okay. Now, assuming then, for the sake of argument, the truth of evolutionary biology
Okay.
concerning human origins, we can imagine sometime prior to 750,000 years ago, a group of hominins, maybe a few thousand. And through a biological and spiritual renovation, perhaps divinely induced, a miracle that caused a genetic regulatory mutation in a pair of these hominins, they were lifted to fully human status and capable of supporting a rational soul through their brain and nervous system. And they would then begin to have children. And I think, given their full humanity, they would naturally tend to isolate themselves from their non human contemporaries. In time, eventually, they and their descendants would supersede all of the non human descendants and eventually give rise to different species of human beings like Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, and Denisovans.
Okay, so tell me if I captured this. Essentially, what you're saying, given evolutionary biology, modern science, whether you accept it or not is a separate question. There would be
Yes.
an evolutionary history up to about 750,000 to a million years ago. And then God selected through some supernatural process a couple out of this, breathed
Yes.
into them in a different fashion. They became the historical Adam and separated themselves from their ancestors. And this is the story that is not told in Genesis, but through mytho-history matches up with this story. Is that fair?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. Very interesting. Now, there's a lot of questions here. We'll come to in a minute. Two things about your conclusion. You say, at the very end, you say, Adam and Eve may therefore be plausibly identified as members of Homo heidelbergensis and as the founding pair at the root of all human species. Bill, after all this research, it's only plausible. Of course, I'm playing the skeptic with you, but is that what you conclude, that it's just plausible?
Yes, I'm not trying to prove that Adam and Eve existed or that they did belong to Homo heidelbergensis. But what I'm saying is that this would be a view that is fully consonant with modern evolutionary biology, with all of the evidence about human origins, and with the biblical commitment to a single pair of human beings who were the ancestors of every human being on the face of this planet, who fell into sin and through whom sin and moral evil entered the world and infected the human race. And that's not just a possible scenario, Sean. That's a plausible scenario. It's fully in accord with the evidence. And so I think it's actually a pretty strong claim to say this isn't just possible, but this is really plausible.
Okay. Very fair. Helpful. Last one, you make this statement, then we're going to questions, is in the very end and kind of this afterthought, you conclude by saying the conquest of Adam and Eve will never be concluded in our lifetime or in any lifetime. how do you know that it would never be concluded with
Uh,
advance in genetics and history and paleontology in, say, 1,000 years?
yeah. I say that because of the sparsity of the evidence that is pertinent to paleoanthropology. These hominid forms are extremely rare, and therefore it's very, very difficult to reconstruct the path of human origins. I have some diagrams in the book that show the areas of uncertainty, and it may
Okay.
be that Homo heidelbergensis might be supplanted by some other human species. As I say at the end of the book, at least for now, it serves as a kind of convenient placeholder for that most recent common ancestor of Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, and other members of the human family.
Hmm.
But given the incompleteness of the evidence, I think it's unlikely that we'll
Okay.
ever be able to bring the quest to a close and say, aha, here, yes, Adam lived in 801,232 BC
Got it.
in the Persian Gulf oasis or something
Okay.
like that.
Okay. Fair enough. Here's a great question for you. I'm really interested how you'll answer this one. Kevin Connor says, hey, WLC and Dr. Sean, agnostic atheist here. Is there anything in your historical Adam theory for people like me, or is this theory only meant for Christians as a way to harmonize beliefs?
It would be meant for Kevin only if one of the reasons that Kevin has for his unbelief is a supposed incompatibility of the primeval history of Genesis with modern science. And I do think that for many unbelievers, that is a major obstacle to their becoming Christians. Now, maybe it isn't for Kevin, but if it were, this would definitely be something for him.
So it sounds like you're really playing defense here rather than offense. The offense would be not offense to people, evidence of the resurrection, experience of Christ, Kalam argument, etc. Okay.
Yeah, in a sense, Sean, in a sense, this is an exercise in Christian apologetics. It's like dealing with the problem of evil and suffering. Here's the problem of the historical Adam. It seems incompatible with the deliverances of modern science. Is it? How do we best solve this challenge?
Here's a question that's come up in different forms a few times for you. Lou Benson says, is the genealogy from Adam to Christ supposed to be historically accurate? Now, I would assume he's probably talking about the genealogy in Luke, but maybe comment on the genealogies at the beginning of Genesis and Luke.
What I would say is that these are genealogies in the primeval history of a mytho-history, a little tiny history that is only about 2,000 or so years in length. And even by standards in the ancient world, people at that time would have realized that this was absurdly short. The ancient Babylonians believed that there were Babylonian kings reigning 432,000 years ago. That would have put them in the Pleistocene era prior to the advent of Homo sapiens. So even in the ancient world, they had a sense of the antiquity of the world, and it would have seemed absurd to think that the world is only 2,000 years old. And so these genealogies, yes, they do give truth about historical persons, but they are genealogies of this little tiny mytho-history.
Okay. Here's a great question for clarification from Nathaniel King has asked a few here. He says, it's difficult to see such a huge disparity between Genesis 1 through 11 and 12 through 50 to warrant an entire change in genre between these two passages. How do you see these sections as so different?
Let me simply assure Nathaniel that this is not viewed as a problem by New Testament commentators. I would encourage him to pick up any commentary on the book of Genesis, and what you will discover is that the structure of Genesis falls into three large pieces. There's the primeval history of Genesis 1 to 11. Then there are the patriarchal narratives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then there is the story of Joseph and his brothers, which is the conclusion of Genesis. And Genesis is just part of the 5-part work called the Pentateuch. So there's just no difficulty in seeing different genres of literature incorporated into a single work. And we have examples of this in other books of the Bible. For example, in the book of Revelation, you have a combination of epistolary literature, letters to the 7 churches, with Jewish apocalyptic about the end of the world. Even in the Gospels, you have historical writing combined with parables, which are not to be taken literally. So honestly, this is just not a serious objection, saying that there are different genres of literature combined in a single book.
Anselman says, WOC, tell us what was the first sin? What was the fall? What is sin? So how does a historical fall fit into your model?
Yeah, let's go at those in reverse order. Sin is disobedience to God. It is putting your will ahead of God's will. The fall was the first moral sin that man committed, the first disobedience to God. What was that first sin? I don't think we have any idea. I certainly don't think it was eating a piece of fruit on a tree. I think that would be a figurative and metaphorical way of telling the story of man's fall.
Okay. Now, you answer this in your book and hinted at it earlier, but I think it might be interesting for people to hear you spell it out a little bit. Kina says, nice to see you back, Kina. She says, how can sin affect everyone through Adam if he was one human among many others, and thus not everyone are his descendants?
Oh, my goodness. Okay, now, Kina, you're not talking about my view. You're talking about Josh Swamidas's view. And this would be one of my objections to Josh's view. I don't see how, if there were other people running around in addition to Adam and Eve, who were their contemporaries, why they would be affected at all by his sin. But you see, my view preserves what I think is the essential biblical truth that every human being who has ever lived on the face of this planet is descended from this primordial human pair, and therefore is affected by their sin in virtue of being raised in a society that's infected and permeated with sin and alienation from God.
Okay, good. Good clarification. Boy, there's a ton of questions here. I apologize to though if I miss. I'm doing your best here. Okay, let's see how you jump in on this one. It says, Daryl Anderson says, do you see the DNA evidence as the main reason to not have an Adam created separately?
I don't understand the question. What does he mean, have Adam created separate? I don't know what he means.
Okay.
I mean, we don't know what Adam's DNA was.
Okay.
The evidence, the DNA evidence, the genomic sequencing of ancient Homo sapiens and Neanderthals indicates that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are both fully human, though different species of humanity, that they interbred with one another and sired children so that you and I bear and carry Neanderthal genes in our body. Probably 2 to 3% of our genes are derived from these Neanderthals. And as I said, the evidence indicates that all of this genetic divergence that the contemporary human population exhibits could have come from an original human pair, so long as that pair lived earlier than 500,000 years ago. But beyond that, I don't know the force of the question.
Okay, that's totally fair. Now, let me ask you one. Choi is a common listener. He won a book recently for asking one of the best questions. And I think this question might illustrate a little different view than what you hold, but it'll give you a chance to clarify your view a little bit here. Okay. He says, if God used evolution to create man and the universe, why would he lie to us with the account
Oh,
of
man.
Adam and Eve?
Yeah. Yeah. See, this is a failure to appreciate different literary genres and that not all of them are to be taken literally. Does Troy think that God has lied to us in the book of Revelation when he says there's going to be a giant red dragon whose tail will sweep one third of the stars
Mm.
out of the heavens? Has God lied in saying that to us? Uh, does does God lie to us in saying that the moon is luminous? Uh, I don't think so. Does when the psalmist says, "Let the trees of the wood clap their hands before the Lord," or God is
Mm.
described as breathing fire and smoke from his nostrils and riding on his heavenly chariot, is God lying to us? Oh, come on. Don't we understand that different kinds of literature use figurative language and metaphor in order to express deep truths?
Mm.
And in the book, I lay out what I consider to be 10 central theological truths that are taught to us by this primeval history. And these are far more important than thinking that there was a Tower of Babel at which all human languages originated,
Mm.
for
Troy,
example.
Troy, thanks for asking this question. I think it's a very natural one when we first hear this view to suspect that God was lying or wrong. Bill Craig's pushback, and it takes some time to really get there and understand, is we've got to look at the genre. We've got to look at the way it was meant to be. And when understood in that fashion, it wouldn't be lying. That's the approach. So great question, Troy. Thank you for throwing that in there and give us a chance to clarify.
You're so much more gracious than I am, Sean. Oh.
We're a good team. That's all right. Here's a good question for you that you weigh into in your book. She asks, are we made in God's image, or is that myth?
I think that we are indeed made in God's image, and that this is one of the central truths that is taught by the mytho-history of Genesis 1 to 11. And I take that image of God to require that we have the cognitive capacities that are sufficient for personhood, rationality, moral agency, intentionality, and freedom of the will. And I have a fairly lengthy discussion of the subject of the image of God in the book, and the way in which the biblical picture of man and his creation is so different from the view of humanity that you find in these ancient pagan myths of Israel's neighbors.
Well, thanks for your work. I definitely want to commend to our viewers in quest of the historical Adam. And I look forward to seeing the positive reviews, the criticism, and just seeing what dialogue comes out of this, because I want to remind people that this discussion is very early in terms of both the theology and the science and how they intersect. And your book is one very important contribution to ongoing conversation. So pick up a copy, write a review, positive or negative. Just a thoughtful, honest review helps the conversation. Thanks for coming on and sharing your quest.